bright up here, isn't it? Okay, I am no tech expert. Where's my laser pointer? Is that laser pointer? Top button. There we go, right on. That's key feature. So good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I'll acknowledge the Yawuru people on whose lands we're meeting today, and thanks also to the KPCA for holding this great event. There's heaps more people here than I expected. I'm a bit nervous. But I think this goes to show that it's a really good opportunity to learn and share information from each other, and also I think you can, well, I certainly can see by the faces in the room that this is a pretty important event. We've obviously had talks from both the federal and state agricultural ministers. We've got the West Australian Chief Veterinary Officer here, who we'll hear from later, and we've got a lot of busy pastoralists and industry stakeholders here who have given up their time to be here. So I think first of all of these talks are pretty relevant. I hope mine's relevant. We have already heard today that we shouldn't forget about biosecurity. So yeah, I think this is a really good opportunity to keep everybody on the same page and also explore new opportunities and things. So thank you for all taking that time. So I've already been introduced. My name's Cass. I'm a regional vet for the Northern Australia Quarantine Strategy. I've kind of come back to this role after a couple of years of pretending to be a manager, and I'm much more enjoying being back in the region and reconnecting with the people on the ground, because I think the relationships, the face-to-face relationships, are really important. And if we're to try and get any kind of message out about awareness of biosecurity and an understanding of what the risks are and could be in the future, I think having a face-to-face relationship is pretty important. So I'm back and very happy to be back. Now, let's see how this goes. So the Northern Australia Quarantine Strategy was initiated 30 years ago after the Lindsay Review identified gaps in our national quarantine system associated with particular features of Northern Australia. We've got 10,000 kilometres of pretty remote, sparsely populated coastline. We've got extreme weather events. We've got close proximity to neighbouring countries, all with quite different biosecurity status and animal health surveillance strategies. We've got large feral animal populations throughout the north, combined with extensive pastoral agriculture systems, which poses a very different set of risks to southern Australia. And this program that I work for tries to address those risks. So the concept of the Northern Australia Quarantine Strategy is, or NAQS I'll call it, is to address unregulated pathways for entry of exotic disease. But to explain that, we need to know what regulated pathways are. So I'll just explain that a little bit. So a regulated pathway is anything that is managed at the border. So you think about when you fly in on an aeroplane or cargo that comes in by ship. And mail, international mail that comes in. There's some stats there from the last few years of the volume of stuff that's being inspected as it comes in. Now that in itself poses a risk, because obviously we can't manually inspect everything that comes in. But those regulated pathways are addressed in their own right. They're managed under biosecurity legislation, and those... Oh, I'm not very good with my... And so they're managed under the biosecurity legislation that addresses compliance and how to manage those issues. So you might have already heard about cancellation of visas of people that are trying to bring in undeclared, large amounts of undeclared pork products, for example. I think there's been another 3 today I read about. So we're up to 5 visas that have been cancelled already. Now that's not a great amount in the grand scheme of things. There's been 27 tonnes worth of pork that's been brought into Australia. and seized at the border, whether that's been declared or undeclared. So there is definitely risks there, but we consider that to be a regulated pathway. So let's talk about unregulated pathways, and we'll talk more about the spread of OSF a bit later on, but the unregulated pathways are things that we don't have any control over, and this is much more relevant to us in the north with our neighbouring countries close by. We've got monsoonal wind patterns that can bring things in, particularly from the northwest during monsoon season. The monsoonal winds are a proven pathway for exotic Chilocortes midges that carry blue tongue virus, for example. It's a likely pathway for mosquitoes up in the Torres Strait, so coming across from Indonesia and Papua New Guinea down into Cape York to potentially bring in Japanese encephalitis. And it's possible but an unlikely pathway for screw and fly. These neighbouring countries all around us, Indonesia and Papua New Guinea and East Timor, all have incidents of screw and fly. We don't have screw and fly in Australia, thankfully. But it's a possible but unlikely pathway to bring across screw and fly. Now, migratory birds potentially pose a risk for bringing in bird flu. Now, this is all a relative risk, right? So we're not about to get bird flu, we're not about to get screw and fly, but this is all possibilities through these potential pathways that we don't otherwise have a means of recognising. So these wader birds stop off in China here to feed on their way back. They breed in the Arctic, come down and feed here for a month or so, and then they fly sometimes almost non-stop from down to Broome, down to Roebuck Bay as a stop-off point. They recover and then they travel on down. Sometimes they stay here, but sometimes they go down through the rest of Australia and into New Zealand. So if they happen to pick up any new viruses in Asia, they could potentially bring in new viruses here. They're not likely to bring in the highly pathogenic stuff because sick birds don't fly that far, but they can bring in new assortments of viruses and mix with our ducks and geese, wild ducks and geese, and then further south get potentially into commercial poultry. So another consideration is for itinerant or illegal vessels that might be either illegally fishing up in our waters or itinerant yachts that might, stop off in Indonesia and then rock up onto a remote beach in Australia without declaring themselves first. They can bring in international food scraps. They can bring in, they might have animals on board if they're a fishing boat. They'll have, some of these wooden boats might have insect borers and termite pests and things that could potentially be introduced to Australia. Oh goodness, I'm not very good at that. Anybody got any tips on how to not make this so sensitive? Right, so ocean currents are obviously a pretty decent consideration for us. You can see here currents wash right past us coming down from Indonesia, and obviously down into the Gulf of Carpentaria is a pretty significant one as well. We have some rangers doing marine debris work, and they constantly pick up Indonesian water bottles and all sorts of rubbish that can wash out from river systems and off ships and things down onto our coastline. So you can see here, this is actually one of those beaches in Arnhem Land. There's a lot of rubbish there. It's not all Indonesian, obviously, but it could potentially be from any other country. It could be thrown overboard from shipping through the big shipping channels that come through. And any of that stuff could have food scraps in that can potentially then be picked up by other animals. This is all or nothing. So then one of the big things we need to address also is that leakage through the regulated pathway. So we know for a fact that we don't pick everything up at the border. We do our best to address it through declarations, through incoming passenger cards in different languages to try and target people who might not necessarily understand the details in English. If you say, please declare all food, some people might not particularly think that the stuff they've got is food in its form. It needs to be cooked or it needs to be somehow prepared elsewhere, and they might not consider it as food. And visa cancellation doesn't seem to be enough of a deterrent. So people are still bringing stuff in, and in its form as it is, so you can see there those pieces are packaged, and it's not all getting fed directly out to pigs, obviously, but if that stuff ends up in the rubbish and then a pig gets onto it, then we've potentially got African swine fever, for example. And I think that you've probably all seen the stats in the media of the 27,000 tonnes of pork that's been seized at the border in the last 10 months. 46% of that has fragments of ASF virus. So that's not to say that it's active virus, right? But half of that product has got the virus in, and of that, a percentage of it could potentially be active virus. Now, the pathway is for that then active virus to get into a piggery or into a backyard pig pen, or to be fed out at in a roadside rubbish bin or something, which is an unlikely pathway, but pretty significant consequences if it happens. I'm particularly bad at this. I'm really sorry. Nobody else has managed this so far. So this map is the best current representation of where feral pigs are distributed across Northern Australia. This data is a mix of our surveillance data, of state and territory culling data points, of researcher data points through Charles Darwin University and various other groups that are doing some research, and non-government culling organisations, sort of up in Cape York there. So you can see, particularly on Cape York and the territory, coastal pigs are a problem. You can see that the pigs will trot down to the beach and potentially scavenge through rubbish. Now this map doesn't reflect domestic pigs. It doesn't reflect any of the backyard pigs or fattening pigs on stations or in communities. And it also doesn't reflect any large commercial piggeries, of which we don't have any left in the north anyway now. There was a couple in the Atherton tableland until the last year or so, but we don't have any large commercial piggeries in the north anymore. So why are we interested in pigs when I'm talking at a cattle industry conference? Because they're a virus factory, basically. They're very good at amplifying virus. You've all heard of foot and mouth disease. Pigs are particularly good at picking up 10 particles of foot and mouth disease and turning it into a potential national disaster. So it doesn't take much for a pig to eat a bit of contaminated food and then pass it on, and then we're in deep strife. So the effects on production and trade for cattle are significant with FMD. We've talked about ASF and the impacts on the cattle industry with ASF, and it's not as significant as FMD, but there could potentially be trade restrictions or transport restrictions or some limited impact on the industry in the north here. But we don't know if it's going to come in. We don't know where it's going to come in first, and we don't know how quickly it's going to be picked up and whether it can be eradicated. So there's a lot of unknowns, and we're just at the moment trying to gather information such as where the pigs are, so that then we can start addressing the risk of if and when it can be a problem. Now you'll see a gap here. I don't know of any pigs in that area, or not any significant populations of pigs. So if anybody does know, if you've got some data points or some records of pigs in this area here in the East Kimberley, let me know. Okay, I've got heaps around Kununurra. And I've got obviously heaps in the Fitzroy Valley and up into the National Park and Prince Regent and Mitchell National Park, but there's a pretty obvious gap there. So it could just be that it just hasn't been populated by pigs yet, or there could be a few little pockets there. So let me know if you see any or know of any. So why do we do surveillance? So we've got a few entwined reasons that all relate to livestock production and trade, basically. We're here to support production and trade, and the earlier we detect these diseases, the quicker we can stamp them out, and the better chance we've got of eradication. We're also looking at evidence of changes in animal health status that could potentially represent an emerging or new disease. So hendrovirus is an example from more than 20 years ago now, but there are novel viruses that have impacts that we don't, we might not necessarily pick up unless we're monitoring animal health on a regular basis. So that sort of fits into this One Health paradigm that human health and animal health and environmental health all tie in together to have impacts on each other. And then also, for us, our main interest obviously is food security. So all of those factors play in together for food security. Supporting trade markets. Obviously, evidence of disease freedom is pretty important, and it's becoming increasingly important for importing countries. For those of you that grow cattle to export, that's pretty hard to read, but they're the second page of health certificates for Vietnam and Indonesia. The first line says Australia is free from foot and mouth disease, screw and fly, bovine spongiform encephalitis. There's a string of diseases that we declare freedom from, and it's very hard to back up that declaration if we don't have any data. So all of the surveillance that's done all over the country feeds into a national database that helps to support our disease freedom. And all of that then ties into our international reporting obligations to the World Animal Health Organization. So that then ties back into our trade market access. An example of some of the programs. Lots of you will know of the NAMP program, the National Arbovirus Monitoring Program. That's particularly relevant towards the blue tongue line, which I'll talk about a bit later on. And obviously, Broome is on the edge of that line, so this is a bit of an interesting place for blue tongue. This map shows where we do our work. So you can see, particularly in the territory in Queensland, it's largely coastal, based on where those feral animal populations are, and predominantly pigs. WA obviously has this inland zone because we don't have a lot of coastal pigs, and our main host populations, both feral pigs and cattle industry, is in the middle inland. So that's where we concentrate our surveillance. And in WA, a lot of our surveillance is public engagement, so standing up here and talking to you about what we're interested in, and then having you understand why we do what we do, and engaging and asking for information back from you. You'll see that the Torres Strait Islands are particularly close to Papua New Guinea. In fact, the most northern Torres Strait Islands, Boigu and Sabai, are 3 or 4 kilometres from the southern coast of Indonesia. So that's pretty important for biosecurity. Papua New Guinea has, the south coast is actually fairly free of lots of this stuff, but Papua New Guinea in general has a few diseases that we don't want, and obviously that's an island bridge where if anything did head down towards the southern coast of PNG, then that's a big risk for the Torres Strait. So we've got quite a lot of surveillance going on, and biosecurity officers stationed on all the islands in the Torres Strait to kind of monitor and address that. And the biosecurity culture in the Torres Strait is incredible. They all understand the importance of biosecurity and actively promote it, and it's a very tight-knit community. There's lots of families that are involved in biosecurity generation after generation. So it's a good place to go for an understanding of what's happening. So what are we testing for? What are we looking for? The criteria for the list is that it has to be exotic to Australia. It needs to have the potential to cause economic loss and production loss, and with effects on the environment or human health, and with significant consequences potentially for a response. There needs to be an unregulated pathway that exists between Northern Australia and the existing distribution of that pest or disease. So for African swine fever, for example, it's now in East Timor, which is only 400, 500 kilometres away from Darwin. And we've got those also the direct flights from various Asian cities into Darwin and Cairns, and then the risk of leakage, so with a massive feral pig population. So that's something that's definitely heightened our interest for surveillance. And then a high establishment potential of the pest and disease in the north, so obviously our feral pig population and extensive livestock for something like screwworm fly to establish is significant. And then the risk of spreading to throughout Northern Australia into other regions in Australia. This is an example of the list. It's too hard to read from there, but basically the big hitters in this list are foot and mouth disease, screwworm fly, rabies, not so much of an impact for livestock, but obviously significant for our dog population. Thorough is a not very well-known disease, but it's a blood-borne parasite that's spread by biting flies, by buffalo and march flies, that affects all warm-blooded animals as far as we know, and it has some pretty significant effects overseas, and we don't know what it would do to our native marsupials, for example. So it's something we don't particularly want. We've got African swine fever on there and a few other pig diseases that are much lower down the list of risk for us. There's also this Northern Priority Disease list over here, which was a list discussed with industry last year, funded under the white paper, and industry came up with a list that largely included most of these, but also some others that aren't on our list because they don't have a direct pathway into Northern Australia. So lumpy skin disease would be really significant impact on northern cattle industry, but its closest distribution now currently is Africa and the Middle East, and there's no natural or unassisted pathway for it to come in to Northern Australia at this point. So, you know, if we saw cattle with lumpy skin, we would still test for it, but we're not expecting, you know, that's not something that we're actively looking for. So types of surveillance, we've got a targeted surveillance program where we go out into the field and we conduct field surveys on domestic and feral animals. So over the next few months and years, I'll be talking to pastoralists and groups across the Kimberley about where pigs are and where the risks are and where we might need to come and focus our efforts. I've already spoken to Abby from Capco about, you know, maybe we want to come and have a look around that area for pigs. There's, you know, we know there's a lot of pigs in the Fitzroy Valley and we haven't been looking there for a few years, so we need to go back and have another look there. The East Kimberley's on my list as well, and we've recently in the last few years done surveys up along the coastline of that Owogo coastline between Wyndham and Columbaroo, and also Columbaroo back down along to the Yampi Sound and Derby, and we've established that there's not a lot of risk there and the risk is much more inland. We've got a few other things, so sentinel herds. A lot of you will have been involved in sentinel herds over the years with the State Department, and it all feeds into this NAMP program for blue tongue surveillance. And then we've also got environmental faecal sampling for bird flu testing and vector and pest trapping for a variety of things like blue tongue and mosquito distribution and screwworm fly. And then we also very heavily over here rely on general surveillance. So this is what this is about. This is making everybody aware of what we're looking for and encouraging people to report if you see anything unusual. One of the big things that's come out over the white paper funding over the last few years has been the development or the improvement on significant disease investigation. So trying to strengthen the relationship between pastoralists and private vets, and then also between pastoralists and private vets and government, so government labs and us in the office, and having an understanding of the types of diseases that turn up on a regular basis, but then also being aware of the sorts of things that we don't have and that we want to be keeping a lookout for. Lots of you will know Graham Mackereth. He's the state field veterinarian, and he's got a post-mortem kit for pastoralists to help with these significant disease investigations. So if you are a pastoralist and if you haven't seen Graham for a kit, please find him. Where is he? He's snuck out. Okay, well, come and find me and I'll show you where his kits are. They're over in that corner. And they've also got maggot collection kits, so we're looking for maggots from live animals that might ultimately rule out screwworm fly, but also if we did happen to have an early incursion of screwworm fly, we'd pick it up on an earlier rather than later, and it's easier to eradicate. We've got an extensive program with Indigenous ranger groups, so there's 69 ranger groups across Northern Australia who contribute lots of different activities towards our surveillance program, and that's the same sort of network that we've got here. So the more people that understand what we're looking for, the more chance we've got of picking something up if there's anything unusual going on. A bit late, but anyway, so that's doing feral animal autopsies, and this fella's been trapping Culicoides midges in Columbaroo for us for 30 years, and Columbaroo is the most diverse and abundant collection of these midges in Australia, so it's a really important site to be finding new things coming in from Indonesia. So we also do school talks, We've got the Indigenous Ranger field activities. We try and join into field day stalls and demonstrations, and we do conference presentations. We've got long-standing interactions with state and federal departments. We work with universities and non-government organisations, environmental groups, and other researchers. And I think the concept of sharing information and resources is really important. It makes for a much more efficient program rather than everybody trying to do their own thing in their own world. It's going well for a while. So this is the Indigenous Ranger Network. So you can see here we've got the north pretty well covered. If there was anything to turn up, on this coastline, on this Balangara coastline here, these rangers here have a fair few phone numbers that they can call and or email, and they've got an app that we've developed that they can report in on, and they can send photos and tell us a bit what's going on. So that ranges from everything from some sick chickens in someone's backyard to they've seen some wallabies with funny skin diseases, and we've had reports of sick cattle from here in the middle of the Kimberley here. So all of these things come into us, and most of the time it's nothing of any exotic disease concern, but it gives us some assurance that there's people looking. There's people understanding what we're after and reporting back on animal health. And I would rather hear 100 reports of, nothing of great concern or something that I can perhaps help out with and give some advice on for the chance that we'll pick up an exotic disease or some sort of incursion. So what are the key issues here? Number one, increase and maintain market access. And to do that, we're, the idea of this proof of freedom of important diseases, there's more and more competition in the market, and we're required to provide evidence of this. We can't just ride on that good reputation that we're clean and green. We need to actually provide evidence of that. So by taking maggot kits, and if you see maggots in live animals, first of all, give us a call if you're not certain, but there's some pretty good instructions in the maggot kits. Pick out some maggots, send them in to us, and we'll most likely be proving that they're not screwworm fly, but if they do happen to be, if somehow we've picked up screwworm fly, then we get it early and we can eradicate it early. The net monitoring I've already talked about. This is the blue tongue line here. So everything above this line is a blue tongue zone that has still some good trading markets, but they're different to say Middle East, and there's some negotiations with China on blue tongue about who we can send to and where we can send to. So obviously keeping an eye on that line is pretty important. We need to know where the free zone is regularly, monthly or quarterly. We need to know where that line is so that we can update our trade and make sure that we're satisfying the importing country requirements. Talked about that already. So the other thing is that if we do get any of this stuff, that we can pick it up early. And as I've said before, the public awareness campaign is the most important thing. I'm one person here in Broome. I can't cover the whole Kimberley. And so having you guys, having the rangers, and spreading the word out further that anything strange or unusual in animal health comes back to us, so that we can, find out some more information about it, ask some questions, and maybe respond to find out what's going on. And I've already talked about Graham's kits. So Graham and I work pretty closely together. His role, I guess, is essentially very similar to mine in that he's also looking for exotic and endemic diseases. But myself or him, if you see anything strange, talk to one of us, whoever you can get a hold of first, and tell one of us what's going on. So, and the idea of distributing the kits to producers is that we can't get out there on the day that something dies often. So if you're, an 11-hour drive away, we can't necessarily get there at that minute. So in consultation with Graham, he'll talk you through doing a post-mortem and talk you through getting some samples that might be able to work out what's going on. So we've been talking a lot about ASF today. It's a very stable virus. It's got the same sort of pathway into Northern Australia as foot and mouth virus. So it would come in contaminated food or rubbish washed up on the beach, or potentially through that leakage pathway. But ASF is a much more stable virus. It can last in salted pork for 1,000 days. It can last in frozen pork for 3 years and possibly indefinitely. It's a very robust virus, and foot and mouth is not such a robust virus. Up here where it's hot and dry, it might last 24 hours on the ground in the dry season, but it obviously has much more significant consequences. So either way, we don't want either of these diseases. That old mantra of reporting early, or if you see anything strange, let us know. People might say, well, ASF up here might actually be a good thing. It might get rid of some feral pigs, and it might bump up our beef prices, and that'd be great. But actually, we don't know what it's going to do in feral pigs. We don't know how it's going to behave. It might wipe out a few initially, but there's a carrier state that keeps it stable in Eastern Europe in the wild boar population. So we really don't want to find out what it's going to do here. And yes, beef prices are fine now, but we don't know what's going to happen with if ASF gets into the north, if it comes in through the Northern Territory or in through traveller pathways through the Kimberley. Potentially there'd be some transport restrictions. Importing countries don't necessarily negotiate based on good science. They negotiate based on what they think the risks are. And so if they think that there might be a risk of ASF coming in on their live cattle, we don't know what that would be. So the best thing is just to keep it out. Let's just not even think about getting it. And somebody's already said it today, but don't forget about biosecurity. So I think we've got a bit of a spectrum here. We're very lucky here that we're a low risk environment. There's that concept of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But we're also a bit complacent, I think, and we ride on the fact that it's hot, it's mostly dry, and our practices are largely extensive, so animals are spread out at a rate of 1 per 20 hectares or something. That's not great for spread of disease. But all those animals come into water troughs and they get onto trucks for transport and they come into feedlots, and that's where disease mixes up. And so in some ways this extensive nature actually increases our risk for something untoward to happen because we are a bit complacent about it. So I think we need to step up to the biosecurity challenge a bit. Lots of people are already onto it. Sarah Simpson is the Animal Health Australia Industry Liaison Officer that has kindly organised our booth for us. So if you don't have a biosecurity plan, have a chat to her about getting a biosecurity plan sorted out for your property, and think about some pretty basic things like on your property having visitors books and addressing swill feeding, so making sure that backyard pigs aren't getting meat scraps, and that any international visitors are, understanding that they're not bringing in food that could potentially end up in any way in pigs' mouths. And livestock depots where animals do all come in together, boot wash bays and that are easy and accessible and easy to use are pretty important. And restricting where vehicles go, so not having a vehicle driving all over the property and potentially spreading animal disease and also weeds and things around as well. This is not just an animal concern, but biosecurity is pretty broad in that sense. And also things like transport. We've been talking about a truck wash here for a long time. I don't have any plans for one, but we should have a truck wash here. That's something that industry needs to address. And there's been a bit of talk about effluent management as well. How to manage, when there's big livestock boats and there's poo all over the road and that sort of stuff, and cleaning trucks down before they go to new properties and things. So what do we ask of you? Report if you see anything unusual. So just think about the big picture. It's pretty hard to put your hand up in a very extreme, very unlikely circumstance. It would be very hard to put your hand up and say, I actually think I've got foot and mouth disease here. That's a very hard thing to do, but it's a hell of a lot easier to stamp out on one property than if it spreads, and if people get in the car and travel, or if you put cattle on a truck and move them around. That's a very quick way to spread it around. So if you notice anything strange going on, if you notice death in a certain paddock, or you bring cattle into the yards and they're just poor doing, or poor doing, unexpectedly poor doing, and don't be afraid to get on the phone and ask. We've got very good vets in the region who happily to follow it up. We've got vets in this significant disease investigation network, so there's funding available to help with those disease investigations. And yeah, so don't be afraid to get on the phone and talk about it. And just the reporting there, so report to Graham, Macareth or myself, and if you can't get either of us, this number is staffed 24/7, so it will go to the district vet, the DPERD district vet on call at the time, and I've tested it, it gets answered, and that's a pretty reliable system. Thank you.